To get started, you'll need your bias binding for the neckline. So you should have a cut strip of bias binding from your continuous bias tape construction. We'll measure and cut that out later, but you can put that to the side. Next, you'll need the cuff pieces if you're working on views 2 or 4. Those are the smaller rectangles, and you should have 2 of those. Next, you'll need your sleeve pieces. So those are the 2 larger rectangles. You should have 2 of them. And of course, make sure you marked your notches as well at the center of both of those. Next, you'll need your lower back facing. There should be 2 pieces. Those are the kind of half moon shapes. You'll have 2 pieces for those as well. And finally, you'll want to grab your front and back bodice or dress pieces, and you should have 2 of those of the same size, and you'll just need those for constructing the neckline, of course. And now that you have all your pieces laid out, let's get started. So to get started, we're going to begin with the shoulder seams for the bodice, and we're going to be hand sewing them with flat felt seams. As you can see, I've gone ahead and pinned my shoulder seams right sides together, and I'm going to arrange my pins so that they are pointed away from me as I stitch. So I'm just going to have them pointed to the right. I am right-handed for reference, so just keep in mind that whatever dominant hand you're using to stitch, you want your pins pointing toward that dominant hand for this part, because you'll be starting on the opposite side. So in order to adequately measure my seam allowance, I'm using a seam gauge and putting it to 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters seam allowance, and I'm just making sure my pins are aligned to about that point, just so I can reference as I sew. I like to hold my work vertically and then stitch upward specifically for this stitch, but you can do what works for you in your making practice if you prefer to hold it a better way. So to get started, I'm using some linen thread and I'm going to knot it. You don't have to knot, I just chose to do so here for the purposes of this video, just to show an easy way for you to get started. And then I have beeswaxed this, as this is linen thread, so you can choose to beeswax beforehand just to have a sturdy piece of thread as you sew. So to get started, I'm just going to anchor the beginning of my stitches by stitching 3 stitches in the same place. Again, if you are choosing to anchor your stitches, then you don't really necessarily need to knot your thread. The anchoring stitches should be good enough to hold the thread in place as you stitch. So I'm stitching 3 stitches in the same place, and I may make a knot or 2 as I anchor these stitches sometimes as well. So we're going to start our seam with a back stitch all the way to the end of our shoulder seam. To do a back stitch, you're going to bring your needle and thread up about 1/8 or 1/4 inch away from the initial knot or stitch, and then you're going to bring your needle back through the initial stitch and bring the needle and thread up away from the exit point of the previous stitch. You want to make sure you don't leave any spaces between the stitches and that they're butted up against each other. And so to do that, you just make sure you're going right through the exit point of the previous stitch and not next to it. So it's called a back stitch because you basically are stitching back to go forward. So you go back through the exit point of the previous stitch and make a new exit point about 1/4 of an inch away from your current stitch. And you're just going to do that until the end of your seam. So to end your stitching, once you get to the last stitch that you've made, you're simply going to make 1 or 2 stationary stitches, and then you can knot through either the beginning of those stitches or the last of those stitches, and just make a couple stationary stitches with a knot to secure your stitching in place. And then you can cut your thread there, and you've completed the first step of the flat felled seam, which is back stitching the first line of stitching. So now that we've gone ahead and back stitched the beginning of our shoulder seam, we're doing flat felled seams here. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut the seam allowance, one side of the seam allowance, and then we're going to fold the opposite side over itself. So generally what I like to do is to press open the seam first. And then take a sturdy pair of snibs and simply cut the seam allowance in half. You can do more if you like. For instance, if you want to cut it down to a 1/4, you can, or an 1/8 of an inch, then you can, but a 1/4 of an inch is perfectly sufficient for you to fold over and hide this. And so what we're going to do is now we're going to fold this part over. And of course it's a lot easier the more clean the edges of your fabric are. But we're going to fold this over and we're going to finger press it down so that you have a nice crease here. And then and we're going to push that down. So push the side, the seam allowance that you just trimmed, then what you're going to do is you're going to press it forward or towards the front, and then you're going to fold the larger seam allowance over that piece, and then you're going to fold it again down. And then you'll have a nice flat seam. Now you can do this one of 2 ways as far as keeping this in place so that it stays here for you while you're stitching. You can pin it in place or you can baste it in place. I have very minimal thread left on my needle, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to baste it in place. If you pin it in place, all you have to do is just pin along these edges, and then as you're sewing, I'm going to show you how to whip stitch, and as we're sewing and whip stitching, you just take the pins out. But for me, I am going to baste it in place. And so what basting looks like is it's pretty much just a set of running stitches, and I'm just going to be totally haphazard here. And since I'm almost double threaded here, then I'm trying to leave that tail out. So you're not really taking it too seriously here. You're just kind of basting the stitch in place, just so it's held for when you whip stitch. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, nothing we're doing really has to be perfect, but you get the point. I'm going to use up all of this thread that I have left on this needle here. And I'm just going to running stitch and baste this. And I am done. So after that's done, I'm just going to pull my needle off the thread. Leave that there. With basting, if you need to adjust it, what's cool is that you can just pull a little bit if you need some more leeway on either side. You just adjust it, and then you have your flat felled seam basted in place. So now we're going to whip stitch the folded edge of the flat felled seam in place so that it's invisible from the other side. And then we are going to move on to the sleeve. So as you can see, I've changed the direction of my work so that it's horizontal instead of vertical as it was previously. And that's just because we're doing a different type of stitch. So pay attention to this area. I'm sorry for the excess fabric here. So this is how I whip stitch. I know many people do it differently. I whip stitch in the direction of my dominant hand. I don't really think there's any rule of thumb for, you know, what you're supposed to do. You should do what feels best for you and what works for you. Many people work in the direction of their non-dominant hand, going in a S formation as they wind around and go above the thread. You'll see what I mean by that when I start doing the way I do it. I like to go from this side to this side as a person who is right-handed. Do what works for you. If you're left-handed, you may want to work towards your left hand, or you may want to start on the side of your dominant hand and stitch upward so that the stitching sets into the fold. You'll see it again what I mean by that. So I'm just going to get started here. And in order to start my stitching, I've single threaded again and waxed my thread. Because I don't want anything to be too tangled, I kept this really to elbow length. I didn't go longer than that. And then I knotted my thread at the end. And so I'm going to start my stitching by going into the folded edge of the flat felled seam. You see I go in and then I come out here. And then to do a whip stitch or an overcast stitch, what you're doing is you're basically wrapping your thread around the edge of the fabric, but also making teeny tiny stitches so that it's not seen on the outside to complete your flat felled seam. And so what that looks like is I'm coming about a quarter of an inch away. I'm making a really, really tiny stitch into the fabric behind the fold and also into the fold. And I'm coming out. And that is your first whip stitch. I'll show you that close up. All right, so we're a little more close up. Now I can show you closer what we're working with. So I have already done my first whip stitch. I'm going to do my second one by picking up a tiny bit of the thread here, of the fabric here in the back with my needle, so that's not seen from the opposite side. You definitely want to make sure you're using a matching thread for this step so that it can't be seen from the opposite side. And then I'm pushing the needle through the top of the folded edge and bringing it back out again. This is the reason I like working in the direction of my dominant hand. I don't have to worry about trying to make sure the diagonal of the thread lays a certain way. It kind of just does it for me because I'm working this way. So then I just continue. And the distance between your stitches, you can make them about 1/4 of an inch. I wouldn't go more than that because you want to make sure you're also keeping your seam strong. You don't want too much space between stitches. And so I've done about 4 or 5 now, and then you can see from the outside, there's tiny, 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 tiny little stitches here that are barely visible. And so if the longer your stitches are from the outside of your fabric, it means you need to make your stitches a little bit smaller as you pick up fabric on the initial part of your stitch. And so I'm probably going to make my stitches a little bit tinier, since the distance between them is a little small here from what I'm doing. You'll see I'm also not really using my thimble for this step. That's just because it's not really needed. So you'll continue this down to the end of your stitching. You can take out your basting stitches as you sew the edge, or you can take them out at the very end and pull them. I'm going to take mine out at the very end so I can keep the stitch in place. So when you get to the end of your stitching here, what you're going to do is you're just going to make one final whip stitch. And then you can just end it with, you know, a basic 3-stitch, then a knot. I like to do 2 knots because I'm like that. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut that off. And like I said, I like to remove my basting stitches at the very end because it's just satisfying. So what I do is I pull one side and then allow it to gather and then completely pull it out. So I'm just pulling one side of the basting stitches. The other side is being pulled out at the time. I may have to shimmy a little bit. Sometimes it gets caught in your whip stitches. And then voila, your flat felt seam is finished. And so this is how it should look from the outside. You shouldn't really see too many stitches. If you notice here, I was a little bit closer and I had about, I don't know, probably about 1/8 of an inch here. And then I kind of spread out my stitching as I kept going along, which I felt gave a better spacing in between the stitches on the outside so that they're not as visible. You can do what works for you. Just depends on how much fabric you're picking up that shows on the outside, but I definitely like this side better because it's not as visible from the outside. And that is how we finish our seams with a flat felt stitch for the Photinia pattern. You can also use your flat felt seam as reference to figure out what your front and back is for your Photinia pattern. So whichever side you folded your seam towards is going to be your back, and then the side opposite of that is going to be your front. So as you can see, I folded my seam this way, and this side would be my back and this side would be my front. It's also designated by your stitching on the front side. Whichever side your stitching can be seen on the right side of your fabric, that's going to be the back, and then the opposite side is going to be the front. So that's good help for reference for you if you don't feel like marking or putting any tape on your pattern.